Welcome to OECD Podcast, where policy meets people.
I've never met anyone who would disagree that culture enriches our economies and our lives. But in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and now, as we face new economic and social pressures, it seems that culture is also under pressure, undervalued, and underfunded. According to a recent study, 10 million jobs were lost worldwide in creative industries in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The sector is regarded as being vulnerable due to the high share of non-standard workers. And although the sector includes a number of global players like Netflix and Sony, 90% of actors are micro-enterprises. To add to this, the true value of culture and creative services is not always fully recognised. Cultural and creative sectors employ a huge amount of people, and OECD data tell us that household spending on recreation and culture grew by 18% between 2011 and 2019. This is in fact twice as fast as overall spending in our economies. So, even though we can see the great contribution that culture makes to our lives and to the economy, government spending on cultural services has been dropping. COVID-19 has led to a funding crunch for culture. I'm Shayne, MacLachlan, and you're listening to OECD Podcasts. Today, we're going to discuss the importance of culture and the creative sectors in terms of their economic footprint and employment, plus the numerous social benefits they bring to people and places. I'm joined by Katia Travkina, who is a policy expert on culture at the OECD. Katia, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to OECD Podcasts.
Thanks, Shayne. It's great to be part of this podcast.
So, Katia, let's get going and start by looking at the diversity of culture and creative sectors. To help our listeners just to get a better understanding of this important area of our economies, can you give us a rundown, in fact, of the different types of organisations, companies, people and places that make up this sector?
Indeed, these sectors are very diverse. Well, let's think about libraries, cultural centres, film production companies, festivals, museums, global streaming services, theatre companies, designers. So all of them belong to cultural and creative sectors. But in fact, their cost structures and business models are very different and vary from non-for-profit to for-profit and to mixed business models.
Absolutely. Thanks, Katia, for unpacking who the actors are in the culture and creative sectors. It'd be great just if you could give us some insight into how the OECD defines culture and indeed how we measure it.
Oh, that's a difficult one because it is very notorious that culture and creative sectors are very difficult to measure. And why is that? Is because countries, in fact, they have their own definitions. For example, some will include botanical gardens or IT companies or gastronomy and the industry of taste or indigenous heritage, which in fact makes international comparisons pretty difficult. So what we decided to do is, in fact, we looked into the work by Eurostat, and they have been doing a fantastic job over the past couple of decades, and they managed to label which jobs are cultural and creative and which businesses or economic activities are cultural and creative. And we used this definition and extended it to other OECD countries beyond Europe. But I need really to use maybe this time to place a call for those who work in statistical offices in member countries to improve the provision of data so that we can have better data for better policies, because still data is lacking for this.
Thanks, Katia, for unpacking that a little bit. I mean, it certainly sounds like culture represents a pretty important chunk of our economy. I mean, I read recently that in some countries, the culture sector is in fact bigger than the aerospace sector. So, I mean, if you could tell us, why the OECD is working on culture and why it's so important at this particular time. And then, I mean, give us an idea, is this a new area of policy research for the OECD?
Well, indeed, OECD works on culture because it's an economic driver. As you said, there are a lot of jobs that this sector provides, and we see that it's over 5% of overall employment in many countries, and even over 10% in some major cities. And this employment was growing very fast before the pandemic, outpassing the overall employment growth. We also see that 7% of enterprises in OECD countries are in these sectors, and they have similar survival, or they have similar performance to enterprises in other sectors. So it's an economic driver. So it's important to look into this. But it's a relatively new area of work for the OECD, that's true, although there were some reports and some work done in the past. But we also now starting to focus our work on how culture can be mainstreamed and used by other policies, in fact, by employment policies, innovation, inclusion policies, so much beyond cultural policies. And what we try to do is try to mainstream culture across these different policy portfolios. And we also see our mission in advising governments, national and local, on how they can adapt their policies, well, again, employment policies, SME development policies, to the very specific needs of these creative sectors to unleash this economic growth potential of culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, culture is an important economic driver. I think we're, establishing that today, but also I think there are certain non-economic factors that we can say about culture. I mean, certainly the story of doctors prescribing cultural activities, kind of these culture vouchers for those patients suffering low morale or other mental health issues during the pandemic, just made us realize, how important culture is, the massive contribution it makes to our lives, to places and to people. I mean, just coming back to COVID, I mean, the culture industry has been amongst the hardest hit by COVID, in particular due to lost revenues and social distancing requirements. I mean, the only industry with higher rates of workers on job retention schemes during the pandemic was, in fact, the accommodation and food sector. And in fact, I mean, at certain points of the lockdown, you'll remember that culture could only be accessed from our couches, in fact. But Katia, if you could just give us some insights into the impact of the COVID-19 crisis, why it was so dramatic on the cultural and creative sectors, and indeed what role the digital transformation has played.
Yeah, you're very right that, and it's well known now that the impact was pretty dramatic on cultural and creative sectors. And why is that? Well, for obvious reason that many of these sectors, like museums or festivals or theatres, were just closed, which means that they didn't have any earned income. They didn't have any income from ticketing, which represents a notable share of their income, in fact. And what they had to do is they had to also lay off some of the temporary staff, or also, and this is quite important, stop contracts with external freelancers that work for them. And as you said in the very beginning, the shares of freelance work are very high in the sectors. And in fact, museums, theatres, design companies, music companies, they rely on this network, local networks of freelancers who one day would work for a theatre and then the other day for a festival, etc. And during COVID, in fact, many of them had to move to other sectors just to earn their life, because they were not always able to access supports. They were not always able to access supports. And now when we see that theatres and museums reopen, some of them are also experiencing these skill shortages because these guys just disappeared. So that's about the venue-based sectors. But of course, we know that some other sectors, they thrived during the lockdown periods because they were already very present digitally, like streaming platforms, or were able to put their content very quickly online. And what we see now in the recovery post-COVID is that these hybrid forms of audience engagement will will remain also for museums and theatre companies, and of course even the fashion industry, etc. So there are the effects were pretty diverse on these sectors.
Yeah, it sounds like there was a lot of work to do, and there continues to be a lot of work to do. So just now, in closing, let's turn our minds to government support. We've talked a little bit about the different actors here, but I can imagine that the culture industry often falls through the cracks of policy support. So, we're reading in the OECD report, the new report called The Culture Fix, that government spending on cultural services has been dropping and represent, on average, 1.2%, just 1.2% of total government spending across the OECD. So my question, Katia, is culture a policy blind spot, and how can cities and regions capitalise on the role of culture going forward during the recovery from the pandemic? And then what are some of the stepping stones that governments can kind of use to create a stronger culture and creative sector?
Yeah, it's very much true that over the past decade, government spending on culture and recreation has been dropping. Of course, we saw during the COVID crisis this tremendous influx of funding to support cultural organizations and sectors. And we also see now that many countries, or at least some countries, include up to 2% and sometimes even more of spending in their recovery packages to continue to support the sectors. But the question is, what is the medium and longer term trend, in fact, with this government spending? And of course, it's not all about money. Maybe a very big attention should focus on fixing the policies that didn't really work and are not accessible for workers and for the firms in creative sectors. And I'm thinking about some of the employment policies, access to social protection, innovation policies, SME support policies as well. So maybe fixing these policies so that they are more accessible for creative professionals and firms is as important as providing direct funding to culture. When you ask about, how governments, national, local, can really use culture in the recovery, there are multiple ways. Well, first of all, is supported as an economic driver, as a sector that creates jobs for you in your local economy. Think about innovation, because, for example, if we think about, let's say, serious games that train doctors, this is something that is very innovative, and this it comes from the creative sectors. And some of the smart regions would include creative industries in their smart specialization strategies. So jobs, innovation, but it's also important to mainstream culture across other policies. When we think about inclusion and education, culture can help increase the levels of self-confidence and motivation, and somehow help to reduce school dropout rates, for example. If you think about well-being, something that you mentioned already, this is something that the sector knew and was very much engaged into, but it was a bit anecdotal that, you practice art, it helps you. But now, in fact, a couple of years ago, the World Health Organization published a big report which proves that it is effective for well-being to practice art and to engage with art, and because it can decrease levels of stress and depression, etc. So this is why places are experimenting with art on prescription, for example. So these are the different benefits beyond economic benefits that culture can bring to places.
Yeah, great. I mean, that brings us to, in fact, the end of our discussion for today. Thanks so much, Katia. It's been a real privilege and great to explore the question on whether the curtains really are reopening for culture. It sounds like we indeed need a sharper focus on the diverse needs of culture and creative industries, and that this will create, in turn, certain economic and social dividends. As mentioned, we have a new report at the OECD called The Culture Fix. So I'd encourage you to explore that one if you're interested. You can find out more by visiting www.oecd.org, and also follow us and our work on Twitter at OECD Local. Also, do stay tuned for our next production of OECD Podcast.
To listen to other OECD podcasts, find us on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud.com/OECD.